What is the principle of sufficient reason? At its core, the PSR states, nothing is without a reason for why it is as it is and not otherwise. In other words, everything that exists or happens must have a reason or explanation. There's no brute randomness. If something is, it's because something else explains it. Schopenhauer takes this idea from Leibniz and reworks it in his own way, making it the foundation of the world as will and representation. Schopenhauer's 4 types of sufficient reason. He argues that the PSR isn't just one simple principle. It actually appears in different ways depending on what kind of thing we're dealing with. So he divides it into 4 categories, which he calls the fourfold root of the PSR. Principle of sufficient reason of becoming, causality for the physical world. Every event has a cause. Example, a ball rolls because someone pushed it. This applies to objects in space and time. Principle of sufficient reason of knowing, logical ground for truth and logic. Every truth must have a reason why it's true. Example, if A equals B and B equals C. This applies to abstract thought, logic, and mathematics. Principle of sufficient reason of being, mathematical and geometrical necessity for space and time. Every position or form in space and time is determined by something else. Example, a triangle's angles must sum to 180 degrees because of how space works. This applies to geometry and spatial relationships. Principle of sufficient reason of acting, motivation for human behavior. Every action must have a motive. Example, you're reading Schopenhauer because you're motivated to understand him. This applies to human will and psychology. Why does this matter? Schopenhauer says this is fundamental because everything in the world, whether physical, logical, spatial, or mental, has to fit into one of these 4 categories. There's no escaping causality, reason, or motivation in any domain of existence. But here's where things get crazy. The subject versus object distinction. Schopenhauer says, the world is representation. It only exists as we experience it. Every representation follows the PSR. Everything we see, think, or experience has a reason. But there must be something beyond representation. That's where the will comes in. Unlike representations, the will does not follow the PSR. It's irrational, blind, and unexplainable. This is the core metaphysical insight of his system. The world as we know it, representation, follows reason, but the deeper reality, the will, does not. Why is this so hard to grasp? He jumps between different domains of the PSR without always making it clear which one he's talking about. He assumes you know Kant's theory of how the mind structures reality. Space, time, and causality aren't out there. They're part of how we perceive. His language can be dense, and he loves long German-style sentences, lol. Making it simple. The principle of sufficient reason explains why everything happens, but in 4 different ways: causality, nature, logic, truth, space-time, math, and motivation, humans. The world is representation, so everything in it follows the PSR. But there's something deeper, the will, which doesn't obey reason and drives everything blindly. That's the big cognitive parallax. Our intellect wants everything to have a reason, but our deeper nature doesn't play by those rules.